think we're definitely seeing that now. We're going to see it in 2021 when we have upcoming city council elections. People that I've met at those meetings who have shown up and who actually know the community are now taking the additional responsibility of saying, hey, I feel like I can represent my community better than whoever has been in office for a really long time. And I've been to these meetings and I know the community and they know me and they're my neighbors. And this is how I'm deciding to show up for my community. So I think that's been really empowering for me to know that, yes, the person on that poster or the person on that commercial actually sits in a monthly meeting with me and gives their evening time to making sure that they know what's going on in my neighborhood.
Yeah, that's how AOC got elected, because the guy that she was running against was an incumbent who was extremely comfortable, thought no one had really given a serious challenge to his seat in a while. And she started holding these meetings, right? I watched this documentary and he didn't show up. So she's sitting with an empty chair, and then a bunch of members of the community are there asking questions, and she's there to answer them, engage them. She went door to door and beat this guy who I forget how many times in the past he'd won, but it's an incredible story, you know. And it just goes to show how acting on, working on a local level can really, it's amazing how many new people you can get engaged that way.
Absolutely. You've already touched on it already, but what can we do, as individuals in our community to, up until election day, like what can we do to like really spread the word and like make sure that we're doing everything that we can in our communities?
I think the most successful movements have been through just sharing what you know with your immediate family and your small group of friends, right? If you're one person and you tell 5 friends, and those 5 friends each tell 5 more friends, you're multiplying your impact by just doing that. Another really fun way and concrete way that I do this is that whenever there's an upcoming election or I've gone out and vote, I try to go out and vote really early. I'll post a selfie with my I voted sticker, and usually friends will get curious and say, oh, I didn't know there was an election happening, or, oh, what are we voting for this time around? And so people, do become more engaged, ask questions, and it's a way for you to say, hey, maybe I don't feel comfortable telling you who to vote for, or maybe I do and I have my agenda, but if I don't, I have these resources, and because you trust me, you're going to listen and you're going to actually go out and vote.
Well, thank you so much, Mariela, for all your time, and we appreciate having you on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, guys.
Bye. So joining us now is Professor Joshua A. Douglas from University of Kentucky Rosenberg College of Law. Thank you so much for joining us here, Professor.
Thanks so much for having me.
We really appreciate you being here. So you have written a book called Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Also, I know you study the field of voting rights, election law, as well as many other things. But first, maybe start off by telling us a little bit about your book, the topics you cover, and how you feel it pertains to the upcoming election and really our election systems in general.
Sure. So, most of what we hear about when people talk about the right to vote is doom and gloom, right? There's this sense that it's becoming harder to participate in our democracy, especially for certain kinds of people, certain demographic groups. There's this feeling that the system is rigged. And, you hear that from both sides, from both the left and the right for different reasons. And yet what I learned through a lot of my research is that there's a lot of good news on the ground in communities all over the country where people are trying to make our system more inclusive, more democratic, to break down barriers, to make it more convenient to vote. And so my book tells the stories of these everyday Americans. I call them democracy heroes or democracy champions that are working to bring more people into the political process, to break down barriers to participation and make it easier to vote. And these are some amazing individuals that I profile, and through their stories, I try to make the case for various reforms to our election system, various things that states and localities are already doing in how we run our elections to get as high turnout as possible. I end the book with this notion of 90% turnout. Typically in a presidential election, we have 60% turnout nationwide. In a midterm, a congressional election, it's much lower. In 2018, we had 50% turnout, and people were celebrating. That was amazing. And I thought, half the people didn't show up. How is this amazing? I mean, it's good historically. We can do a lot better. And so the book is really a call to action to all of us to go into our communities, to dive in and to make this thing so much better. And I think doing so can really change the scope of our democracy.
Wow. Yeah.
So can you explain for people who don't know what voter suppression is and possibly how that is carried out, how it's executed?
I think a good definition is simply any policy or mechanism or practice that makes it harder for people to vote. And typically what we see is that these sorts of things like strict photo ID requirements for voting or purges of the voter registration rolls, proof of citizenship requirements to register. Some states tried to pass a law that you had to provide a documentary proof of your citizenship in order to register. Historically, we had things like the poll tax or literacy tests, or you can't register to vote unless you can tell me how many bubbles are in a bar of soap or how many beans are in a can. Obviously, they have a racial impact, and was the real force behind them historically. And I think there are also lingering racial effects on many of these activities. And the nefarious kind, the kind of voter suppression that we think of as kind of evil, is where you're doing so to try to cut out a certain segment of society, whether it's racial minorities, whether it's one political party. And unfortunately, ours is a history of voter suppression. So what I try to do in my book is I try to contrast that with, we have this voter suppression. At the same time, there are mechanisms to push back against that. And, ours is a history, I think, of ever expanded voter access. If you think about our founding, the first elections were only white male property owners that can vote. And, now 100 years, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. So obviously our elections are better now than they were then, but they're still not perfect. And modern day voter suppression tactics, I think, are one reason for that.
So, I mean, do you think that we're starting to head in a more positive direction, even with, everything you hear in the news and the media going on right now? Like today, do you feel like there is still an active element out there trying to cause and create voter suppression, or is it the opposite where things are starting to open up and get better, or is it a mix of both?
I think it's a dual story. I think there's only almost two tracks. And in fact, sadly, I think you almost see two Americas in terms of their voting policies, with one set of states that have certain policies that are much more inclusive and make it easier to participate, and another set of states that make it harder to vote and have a lot of voter restrictions. And it's not going to surprise you, unfortunately, that tracks partisan lines as well, where one party is seen right now as trying to make it easier to vote, and the other party is seen as trying to make it harder to vote because of the effects, I think, that those political parties feel like they'll have on their ability to win, on the outcomes. So it's really a dual track. It's a complicated story. You have these voter suppression tactics like voter purges of the registration rolls, like photo ID requirements. But at the same time, you have what I call pro-voter policies, like easing registration rules, allowing people to register on election day and vote. No requirement that you register ahead of time. Or before the pandemic, we had states moving towards universal vote by mail, where everyone was automatically sent a ballot. And I think that's actually happening in both so-called red and so-called blue states. But it's a great example of a pro-voter policy.
Yeah, and I guess it's really interesting because those two different sides that are both making progress further solidify the red and the blue states in a way. But it's like a lot of those red states might be more blue if there wasn't so much voter suppression in the cities and in the urban areas, because that's where the highest concentration of people are. So, I suppose that's why it's important that, to pay attention to each state whatever state you live in, what the policies are on that stuff and help. And that's why I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, some organizations that are out there that do help, let's say in low-income neighborhoods that are hurt the most by voter suppression, voter ID, for instance, helping people get state-issued IDs, and helping, people get to the polls in one way or another, helping to open more polling locations. Are there some organizations that it's good to point to for that? Or, I mean, I'm sure there's many, so it's hard to pinpoint, but.
Yeah, and let me emphasize that, when I talk about the red and the blue differences in terms of how we vote, that's not universal, which is to say that there are some voter policies that are being passed in both red and blue places around the country. And so what I think, in this super polarized time period, we actually need to focus on the kinds of policies that are receiving widespread support, like universal vote by mail, like same-day voter registration, and like getting IDs into people's hands if we're going to have a photo ID requirement like you just mentioned. And so the groups that I point to are all nonpartisan. They're just all about getting people to vote. So one excellent organization is called VoteRiders. This is a group that goes into states and communities and as you mentioned, cities, and just helps people obtain the IDs that they need, which, that helps them not only for voting, but in their everyday lives. Because, although voter ID laws are a form of voter suppression because they tend to target the people who don't have an ID, and the people who don't tend to have an ID are poor, racial minorities, students, elderly, and so, it has a disproportionate impact on certain communities. But what a group like VoteRiders does is goes into those communities and help people, for example, obtain their birth certificate that they might need to get an ID. Another similar group is called Spread the Vote. Spread the Vote focuses really on students and minority communities in particular. I profile both of those organizations in my book. As you said, there's tons of organizations. And in fact, the appendix to my book has a list of all 50 states and about 3 or 4 organizations in each one that are working on issues of democracy reform. So my hope is that someone reads the book, feels inspired that they too can make a difference, flips to the back to find their state, and contacts one of the organizations that's listed for their state.
Very cool.
So I have a couple of, like a 3-part question kind of. How long has voting by mail been around? How many votes each year typically, not in a pandemic obviously, come in by mail/absentee? And also, is it true that mail/absentee ballots are the same in all but 5 states?
Okay, so 3-part question there in terms of first, how long have we been voting by mail? All states have had some kind of vote by mail since the Civil War, and that's absentee balloting. Because it was really Abraham Lincoln who wanted to continue being able to fight in the war in 1864, and yet had all these troops scattered about, fighting against the Confederacy. And so states came up with absentee balloting procedures so these soldiers didn't have to come home to vote, in part so he can get reelected. So states have had absentee balloting for decades. Many states put it in their state constitution, that a requirement that absentee balloting is available. Now, in terms of the differences between absentee balloting and vote by mail and universal vote by mail, these are all terms that are thrown around a lot. So 5 states, as you mentioned, automatically mail a ballot to every registered voter in the state. Those are Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and California. Almost all of California used to, and now this year California will be an entirely vote by mail state. But you also have states like Arizona, which about 75% of the vote in Arizona is by mail. Minnesota, I think, is a pretty high. I think it's over 50%. These states that have, what's called no excuse absentee balloting, that is, you don't need to provide an excuse, you can just request your ballot. You're not automatically receiving it without doing anything, but the voters themselves like the process so much that so many voters go ahead and do it, again, even before the pandemic. So the question of, how is it differ between the states? There's universal vote by mail, which I refer to as the states that automatically send you a ballot. And again, there's 5 of those, and I think there's 5 more that are going to do it for this year as kind of a one-time deal. But I suspect they're going to see the success of that, and they may continue it. And then there's the other states where anyone can get an absentee ballot, but you have to request it. And then there's the final set of states where you need an excuse still to vote absentee. Right now, as the time of that we're chatting, 6 states for the 2020 election are still requiring an excuse, and COVID-19 doesn't count. Concerns about COVID-19 don't count in 6 states.
What states those are?
So it's Texas is one of the big offenders, Tennessee, Indiana, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Mississippi are the evil 6. Perhaps we can call them, because they're the ones that I think are still making it too hard to vote. That said, even those states, there's litigation going on right now. There's lawsuits in those states, and there's legislation being proposed. South Carolina might come off the list because one house of their state legislature has passed a rule to let anyone vote by mail if they just cite a coronavirus concern. So we'll see. I mean, the time is running short. But right now, as of our taping of this, it's 6 states.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Texas, and I actually looked into this, and that is what I found out. I was like, oh no, like I absolutely have to go, and I made the commitment. Obviously, like I'm gonna get up, I'm gonna stand in line, no matter how long it takes, to make sure that my vote is counted.
So I have a question. It's that people are starting to get a little bit nervous about their mail-in ballots, and like we're seeing articles come out now that your votes won't be counted, for a few days after election night. So on election night this year, we're not going to know who the president of the United States technically is. And, it gives people a lot of anxiety on whether they should, take that risk or, just show up at the polls. And, back in the day, we had that situation where, a lot of votes were contested with George Bush, and there you had the hanging Chad. And now I hear that there's 5 different ways your mail-in ballot could be, thrown out if your signature doesn't match. What would you say to people who are a little bit anxious about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things to discuss there. So, one, we do know that the rate of ballot rejection is higher with absentee or mail-in ballots than it is with in-person votes. So, if you're able to vote in person, especially if there's an early voting period where you can show up in person early voting, if that's a concern of yours, it's not a bad thing to do that. There's been a lot of conversation about the U.S. Postal Service and the delivery of ballots. I think that, especially as we get closer and closer to November 3rd, it's maybe a better bet to deliver your ballot through a drop box. And virtually every state has secure drop boxes to take ballots. So if you don't feel like you want to trust the Postal Service, maybe it makes more sense to hand deliver your ballot through the drop box. But to your broader question about, election night, we're used to staying up late. And, eventually the networks make a call as to who the next president of the United States will be. I think it's very unlikely we're going to see that this year. And here's why. So many of our ballots across lots of states, including the so-called swing states, are going to be by mail. And those ballots can't be counted until November 3rd, until what we traditionally consider election day. Some of the states can start processing them, right, to make sure signatures match and whatnot, but actually the counting can't happen until November 3rd. So we may know a count based on who showed up in person and whose ballots have been delivered already in some of the states, but that will be very incomplete. The other thing we know about mail-in ballots is that for whatever reason, Democrats tend to vote by mail more and tend to deliver their ballots later in the election season. And so this is referred to, as well documented, as the big blue shift. That is, as the counts go on after Election Day, as more and more ballots come in after Election Day and they're counted, and these are perfectly valid, Democrats tend to do better. We saw this in 2018, actually, where the media didn't recognize kind of a big wave in the congressional elections on election night. But as the ballots were counted in places like Arizona and other places, California, that have a lot of mail-in ballots, Democrats started doing a lot better. And so I think we can expect the vote totals to shift from November 3rd in the next several days after that. And that's perfectly normal. That's just the ballots being counted. And just the phenomenon of Democratic-leaning ballots tend to come in later. There's nothing fraudulent about that. And to dispel one other myth, lots of people I hear say, well, I've heard that absentee ballots don't count unless it makes a difference in the outcome. That is absolutely not true. Every single absentee ballot counts. The election is not final until it's certified by the election officials. What we hear on election night is just the media doing the media's thing and nothing else besides that.
We should be bracing for a almost month-long time after election night of not knowing who the president is.
Well, I don't think it'll be a month is my guess, because although that's the deadline, states will finish well before that, right? So, I think within maybe a week or so, we'll have a good sense of who the next president is. And, obviously we'll come down to some of the key states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida, some of those swing states, and how long did they take for their ballot counting?
Well, with the current president talking about, voter fraud and in mail-in, voting, I just had a few questions on that. And, A, how prevalent is voter fraud? And with the current president also telling people, whether in jest or in seriousness, to go put in a mail-in vote and then also vote in person, what's the likelihood of that being caught by election officials? Like how good is the structure to be able to count, to be able to see if that has happened and to discard those votes? And are those people who do that, A, breaking the law, B, are both their votes not counted, and C, what's the penalty for that?
Yeah, so let me take your first question on voter fraud first. I mean, how much voter fraud is there? The answer is very little. So we talk about voter fraud different kinds of ways, the kind of voter fraud that exists. So let's talk about photo ID requirements. Photo ID laws only root out one kind of fraud. That's in-person impersonation, someone showing up to the polls pretending to be someone they're not. That happens almost never. One study of over a dozen years looked at basically every election during those dozen years, so over 1 billion ballots cast, and found only 31 possible instances of voter fraud. And then when diving into those 31, about half of them were things like a father and a son with the same name, and the juniors showing up and getting checked in under the senior's name with the poll book. So, voter fraud, it just does not happen. So the specific question about double voting, right? Sending in your mail-in ballot and then showing up to the polls. First, election officials have a mechanism to track that, because when they send your absentee ballot out, it's tracked and there's a record in it with your name. So when you show up to the polls, they're going to say, "Wait, hold up, you've requested an absentee ballot." Yeah. Now, if you say, "Well, I never received it," you're going to have to cast what's called the provisional ballot, which is basically the same ballot, but it's set aside, and then we figure out after Election Day whether it should count or not. If you have submitted your absentee ballot, the election officials are going to say, your absentee ballot's been received, and if you try to vote here in person on the machine, you're committing a felony. That's double voting. Every state and federal law makes it a crime to vote twice. So the system is set up to catch this. Now, I think election officials are going to be completely overwhelmed if you have thousands upon thousands of people doing what the president suggested. So it's dangerous for the election system, and they're committing a felony if they do it. But there are mechanisms based on ballot tracking to root out this when it might occur on occasion.
Yeah, and I think perhaps part of the, we're trying not to be too partisan here, but I think a lot of the reason that he may have suggested that is because voter fraud is so rare. He wants to show up, well, this year with this mail-in, there was so much fraud. You had people doing this and that, and everyone will forget by that time that he's actually the one who suggested it. And so he could be trying to create some unrest or some confusion in that way. So I'm glad that we're clarifying that.
And this is not a partisan statement for me to say that it's very dangerous for the president of the United States to be undermining the democratic norms that we have used for years, to be undermining the hard work of local election officials, and planting these ideas, which is going to overwhelm the system. If we have a free and fair democracy, we should let everyone vote and let the chips fall as they may. And unfortunately, throughout the year, he's been undermining the legitimacy of the election process, presumably in case he loses, then he can have something to latch onto to potentially contest the results. But it's really dangerous for democracy. And again, that's not a partisan statement. It's a factual statement. I would say that about any candidate who is making these kinds of wild accusations without any facts whatsoever.
Well, this has been a lot of really, really good information. Can't thank you enough for being here, Professor.
My pleasure. And it's great to have you all doing this and, reaching out to your fans and making sure, because, our democracy is only as strong as everyone who participates in it. Our Declaration of Independence says that democracy is legitimate based on the consent of the governed. Shouldn't the governed include all of us? And that's really what I'm all about, is finding ways to make sure, I don't care who you vote for. I don't care which side wins. I, of course, have my personal preferences, but as a scholar of democracy, I care about democracy flourishing through everybody participating. And that's really what this is all about.
Absolutely. Awesome, man. Thank you so much.
And your book highlights that well. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, finally, for our musical segment, Nikki and I are joined by Nigel Hall and Steve Swatkins on this OJ's tune, Put Our Heads Together. Check it out.
All right, let's put our heads together. One bar count off, because that's all I got. All right. 1, 2, 3.
All right, everybody, that's it for this time. Thanks so much to our panel, to all of our wonderful guests, to our musical guests. Join us again next time for episode 2. Until then, stay safe, much love, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.